Happy Halloween and welcome back to Interpreting the Scares. Today we're doing another ranking video. And this one's actually going to be interesting because I'm doing two different things. First, I'm looking at every single movie that I reviewed this month and ranking them from worst to best. And secondly, I'm actually going to rank each of the franchises too, based on their overall average score. But I'm going to try to speed it along because 31 movies is a lot and there's 7 franchises to talk about on top of that. So here's what I got in mind. I'll split the rankings up by tier, or more specifically by letter grade, and go from there, because regardless on what I scored a movie, I often have pretty similar feelings for each film if they're in the same letter grade. Are you ready? Because I am. Let's get cracking! First, we look at the letter grade of F. This covers movies that were rated from 0 to 55%, and thankfully, only one movie all month got an F. In 31st place, it's Paranormal Activity 4 at 52%. It hurts my heart to say that a Paranormal Activity film got an F. But this was part of the series that started to get on my nerves. 1, and 2, it was one of the biggest plot hole movies in the entire bunch. The boy in the movie, Robbie, was just annoying. Its only saving grace was the Xbox Connect stuff, which at the end of the day just felt like a commercial. Next, we look at the letter grade of D, which covers the scores between 56 and 69%. Now, I don't typically do, D minus, D, and D plus, because when I was in school, if I got any of those grades, I would just look at it and be like, I got a D. So I translated that same thought process to my scores, and in this section or tier, we have 6 movies. From worst to best, they are The Human Centipede 2, The Human Centipede 3, Fright Night 2, New Blood, Resident Evil Apocalypse, Paranormal Activity, The Ghost Dimension, and Paranormal Activity 3. Now, you can see all those scores right over there, and you'll notice that there's a few ties in the list, and it's true, there's a ton of ties on my reviews this month, but I can still say that they aren't perfect ties, because certain things within each movie stood out as either better or worse. For instance, The Human Centipede 2 is one of the most vile and disgusting movies I've ever seen in my entire life. If it were my choice, I'd throw it into the F pile as well, but I can at least say that it's made well enough and was technically smart here and there, which saved it in the end. It tied in its score to The Human Centipede 3, which I can tell you wasn't made as well or as smart as 2, but I was more entertained with it. It didn't make me want to vomit. So guess what? The bias score for Human Centipede 3 was a little bit higher than 2, so that's what I'll prefer to see. Fright Night 2's in here because it's hard to really call it a movie. You can't really call it a sequel. It's just another remake. It does have some cool ideas in there, though. And then there's 3 movies that got a 68% score. You got Resident Evil Apocalypse, Paranormal Activity, The Ghost Dimension, and Paranormal Activity 3. They're all rated 68%, and I feel the same way about them all, but Resident Evil is the worst out of the 3 simply because it's the most boring of the 3. My bias score for The Ghost Dimension was a fraction higher than the Resident Evil movie, and my bias score for Paranormal Activity 3 was a fraction higher than The Ghost Dimension. So that kind of tells you the sequence of what I'd rather watch first, which is what my ranking is all about. Next, we look at the C- letter grade, which covers the ratings from 70 to 72%, and within that small window of error, there are yet another 6 movies, so you can imagine that there's definitely ties. From worst to best, those movies are Resident Evil, The Final Chapter, Scream 3, Fright Night, the original movie, Resident Evil Extinction, and Resident Evil Afterlife. Whew boy, where to begin? Let's start with the smaller tie between the 2 Resident Evil movies, or more specifically, the first and last movie, and interestingly enough, it makes sense that these 2 would be scored similarly because the final chapter kind of came full circle and wrapped around back to the first film. In this instance, I can tell you that the technical score for the first film was better, but the bias score for the final chapter was higher because I felt like it all has to do with budget. The last movie is much more forgettable than the first, yeah, but it feels much more cinematic and much more in line with what Paul Anderson probably had in mind when he made all these movies. Most importantly, you didn't really see Alice's full potential until after that first film, and Alice is what makes these movies, so the scores make sense. Next, the 4-way tie between all these 72% movies. The worst of them was Scream 3, and it makes sense. Scream 3 was the worst Scream movie because it had lost the spark of comedy. It felt too serious, the kills weren't even that unique, every other Scream movie felt like it fit within somewhat the same personality, and this one, not so much. The original Fright Night is next, which is a movie that I had a lot of fun with, but I was left a little bit disappointed at the lack of horror theme. It was decent in its comedy, but it lacked significantly when it tried to balance that with horror. That's more of a technicality though. And then we have yet another 2 Resident Evil movies facing off. You got Extinction and you got Afterlife. Extinction was made pretty well. It felt like a good post-apocalyptic zombie film, but at the same time it was boring. That's why at the end of the day, Afterlife came out on top. It was more unoriginal, but it was more exciting to watch. Now we look at the movies in the C letter grade, which covers the scores between 73 through 75%, and yeah, once again, we're looking at 6 more movies. From worst to best, they are the remake for Fright Night, Paranormal Activity, the marked ones, The Final Destination 3, Final Destination 5, and the Human Centipede 1. Yeah, we're looking at another 4-way tie. Who would have thunk? So first, 73%. The worst of those is the Fright Night remake, which I thought worked for what it was. It's decent, but it's also the only Fright Night movie not to really utilize practical effects work. Even the 2013 movie, which wasn't that good at all, used practical effects. Slightly higher in bias is the Paranormal Activity Marked Ones movie. I used to hate this movie. I considered it the worst in the franchise at a point, and upon rewatch, there's definitely things that I actually appreciated about it more. Once I got those expectations out of the way, I had a fun time with it, honestly. Slightly higher in bias score still is The Final Destination. This is the first 3D movie in the series, which goes all out, and some of that hurt the movie, obviously, because it's kind of low on the totem pole, but I can't say that I hate it either. I had a good time with it. I liked the characters, all that, and slightly higher on the bias score still is Final Destination 3, which is the movie with the roller coaster. Not bad overall, still kind of felt like it belonged in the series basically, and it used some really interesting ideas about paranormal photography. Then we go a little bit higher at 74% for Final Destination 5, which was the final movie in this series, and it kind of circled everything back to the first movie in a very effective way. Also, the 3D in this movie wasn't as over the top as the fourth film, hence it was a little bit smarter in what it did. 75% is Human Centipede 1, which, like the others, is gross, but it still felt like a movie. I can at least say that about it. It felt like a movie that was thrilling and kind of mysterious, and it had somewhat okay acting. It was still trying to be a movie, while the others, I feel like they just kind of gave up. Next up, we're looking at our C+ movies, going over the scores between 76 through 79%, and these movies are, from worst to best, Fright Night Part 2 and Final Destination 2. Finally, no tie. Final Destination 2 is lower on this list simply because, I don't love it. It's not the first movie that I think about when I think about this franchise, but it is made well. It still does fit very well from where the series began, and that deserves props. Fright Night 2, at least the original Fright Night 2, was a very fun movie. Lots of great uses of practical effects that would make the first film proud, and introduction to some new vampires that were interesting to learn about, and a much more balanced approach to horror and comedy. The first film felt kind of uneven because the horror wasn't that tense, but this one fixed that issue. Next up, we look at the top 10 movies that I saw this month, starting with the letter grade of B-. B- covers the ratings between 80 and 82%, and there are 4 movies in this tier, all of which are tied at 80%. These movies from worst to best are Scream 4, Final Destination, Cube, and Cube 2 Hypercube. Yep, the third 4-way tie this month. Each of these movies, I had a blast and a half watching for various reasons, and I mostly feel the same about each one, given the fact that they're all scored the same, but average technicality and entertainment scores dictated this specific order. Scream 4 is at the bottom because even though it's really cool to see some of the same cast come back time after time, several years after the series began, it kind of lost a bit of what made it so interesting in the first place. It wasn't as balanced between horror and comedy. Not everybody can enjoy the series anymore. This movie was really bright and vibrant and campy and whatever, so I like that kind of stuff. I had a good time with it, but I can see where a lot of others wouldn't. The original Final Destination is good stuff. I wouldn't have ever seen it if it weren't for my mom, who went to see it, hated it, and warned me against it, so obviously I had to see it ASAP. And I loved it. I love the atmosphere, I love the concept, I love how it kept on telling you that you lived in a world surrounded by things that could kill you at any given moment. That was great stuff. Then you have the 2 Cube movies. Cube 2 is slightly higher than the first Cube for one reason only: character importance. The first movie purposely chose a bunch of characters at random without any real significance because that mirrors how rats work in a rat maze. But the second movie introduced characters that had importance. They all had a reason for being there because they were all connected in certain ways, and that gave my people score just a slight nudge in the right direction for this to be a better movie. Next up, we take a look at the letter grade of B, which covers the ratings between 83 and 85%, and there are 5 movies in this list. From worst to best, those are Cube 0, Paranormal Activity, Scream 2, Paranormal Activity 2, and Resident Evil Retribution. A couple of ties on this list. These movies are often the movies that I think of the most in this list. Cube Zero I had only seen once before, and even though I like the simplicity of the first two movies a little bit more, the technical improvements that they made with this third film, along with the better balance, actually made the movie stand out as better. Paranormal Activity, of course, is one of my favorite horror films, bar none, and I think it's the only film on this entire list of 31 movies to get 100% on its bias score, which, as you know, that has to mean that the technical score is low for it not to have won the whole thing, and that's true enough. Scream 2 is next, which was really good with the comedy, much like Scream 4, but it felt much more in tune and balanced with the theme of horror, which was still as lively as it was in the first film. When I think about the Scream franchise as a horror comedy series, I mostly use the examples set forth in Scream 2. Paranormal Activity 2 surprised me. While I'd still rather watch the first film, I can tell you that Paranormal Activity 2 is creepy. It feels much more like an actual Paranormal Activity movie because they set up all the cameras around the house, and it sets up the story for the rest of the series, which is really, really important. That's why this is technically scored 1% higher than the other. As for Resident Evil Retribution, I mean, that's my favorite movie in the Resident Evil series. I love it. I think it's a ton of fun. It's the only movie in the series that is shot and edited as well as it is, and the choreography is top-notch there. If I had only one movie in the entire Resident Evil series to watch, it would undoubtedly be this one. Last but not least, in the letter grade of B+, which covers the scores between 86 through 89%, is one movie, the best horror film that I saw all month, Scream, at 86%. This is a solid slasher film with just a hint of comedy that works for what it is, because it's actually one of the smartest written horror films that I can think of. The ghost face mask itself, that's been on the streets every Halloween since this movie came out in 1996, making it instantly iconic. The phrase, "What's your favorite scary movie?" That's also an iconic line. The killer, once you learn their identity, it's nuts. This is classic for sure. It's as exciting as it is well made. That brings us to our ranking of each franchise. This should go a little bit quicker because there's only 7 of them. In 7th place at 68% is The Human Centipede. The worst horror franchise that I've ever watched, really, was The Human Centipede. You can see how I ranked each movie on the side there. It's disgusting, unapologetically so. The second one particularly made me want to throw up. It's also the only series on this list that I wouldn't ever revisit. In 6th place at 71% is the Paranormal Activity franchise. Yeah, this one didn't do so well. I mean, I love the first movie, and I really dug a lot of what the second one was going for, but from there on out, it kind of dug itself into a hole, and instead of trying to get out of the hole, it kind of just kept digging. There were things that I liked about each one, absolutely, but I will not be praising it as a whole. In 5th place at 72% is Fright Night. This series is interesting, and I don't want to outright say that they get worse and worse as the years go by, but technically speaking, that's kind of how it goes. That being said, I mean, they're all relatively rated the same. Other than the 2013 movie, man. The 2013 film. I don't even know what to say about that one. It's not a sequel. That much is true. In 4th place at 73% is Resident Evil. Truth be told, if it weren't for Retribution screwing up my scores here, the franchise would actually probably be scored a lot lower. But I love Retribution, and my love for it is carrying all the others higher than it would normally be. Is it the best horror video game adaptation series? No! Most people hate the crap out of it, but I have a good enough time with it. I have fun with it. In 3rd place at 76% is Final Destination. It's not hard to see why this one's in the top 3, right? Because it's one of my biggest guilty pleasure series of all time. They're all relatively the same exact thing, and they're all just one big gimmick film after the next, but I do love them anyway. In 2nd place at 81% is Scream. For a long time during this entire month, Scream nearly won. Even with the third film, which was easily the worst in the series, it was still a decent movie at the end of the day and didn't really drag down this score. This is a solid series, and I'm interested to see where it goes next, but that brings us to number 1. In 1st place, the best franchise that I saw all month was Cube at 81%. Yeah, I think the best horror franchise all around was Cube. And even though it has the same score as Scream, its average bias score is at 91%, while Scream is just kind of stuck at 87%, meaning that if you gave me 2 box sets to watch, one was Scream, one was Cube, I'd smile a fraction of a bit more at the thought of watching the Cube series again. But that's it! Thanks so much for joining me for this insane ranking video. Please make sure that you hit the thumbs up button if you enjoyed this ranking video, because I make these all the time, and a thumbs up goes a long way to show how much you care about it. And hit the subscribe button and bell to be notified when I come out with my next ranking video. And until then, peace out.
Dave examines movies we just watch for fun. Davey is the expert, he is the #1 critic that I go to when I need a movie pick. Thanks for joining up with